Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Cabinet of Curiosities on our own devices. I'm Jean Messier, and I'm here at 17 Wing in Winnipeg having a look at a fascinating artifact from their heritage collection. This is a hydrogen detector. Now, when I first found this and started doing a bit of research for this video, I wasn't able to come up with a whole bunch of information about this particular type of instrument. About all I had to go on was the word hydrogen and the name of the manufacturer printed on the dial. Now, this was manufactured by J. Davis & Sons of Derby, England, who were a major producer of survey and scientific instruments during the first half of the 20th century. And so, best as I've been able to find out, this is an instrument of First World War vintage that was likely issued to the Royal Flying Corps balloon squadrons for use on hydrogen-filled observation balloons. And how you would have used this is you would have held it by the handle, pressed it up against the envelope of the balloon, and as you moved it back and forth, any hydrogen leaks would show up on the dial. Seems simple enough, but at first I was rather baffled as to how this actually worked, because there was no physical or chemical process for detecting hydrogen that I could think of that was reliable and compact enough to fit in an instrument of this size. And so, again, rather baffled as to how it worked, but the more I looked at it, the more I realized this is probably not intended to detect hydrogen per se, but rather the pressure difference created by any escaping gas. So this is just a very sensitive manometer or pressure gauge. And to test this theory, I wrapped the entire instrument in saran wrap and tape to form a sealed chamber with a flexible membrane. And when I pushed on the membrane, lo and behold, the dial started to move. So indeed, this is just a pressure gauge. And how I think this would have been used is, again, you would have held it by the handle, put it up against the skin of the balloon, and then you would have opened this little release valve in the back here to release any pressure built up by pressing the device against the skin of the balloon. You would then seal off the valve, and as you pass this over the skin, any leaking hydrogen would create a very small increase in pressure that would show up on the dial. And about the only other control you have on this device is this little knob right here, which is used to reset the dial to 0. So while this artifact is fascinating in and of itself, what I find particularly fascinating is how it speaks to the vital but often underappreciated role played by observation balloons during the First World War. Now, when we think of First World War air combat, we tend to think of famous fighter aces like Manfred von Richthofen or René Fonck or Billy Bishop duking it out in the skies over Western Europe. But the whole point of having fighter aircraft in the first place wasn't so that they could fight each other, but rather so that they could shoot down enemy observation aircraft and balloons. And it was this role of aviation in conducting reconnaissance behind enemy lines and directing artillery fire that was actually far more strategically vital than fighter aircraft shooting each other down. So the military utility of balloons was recognized very early on, and indeed the Montgolfier brothers, who in 1783 carried out the first manned hot air balloon flights, speculated that within a couple of years, large armadas of balloons loaded with soldiers could be used to carry out surprise airborne assaults on distant targets such as Gibraltar. And it would be only a little more than a decade later that balloons would be used in combat for the very first time during the wars of the First Coalition, immediately following the French Revolution. So the new Republican government was desperate for any military advantage it could get its hands on, and so in April 1794, it readily accepted a proposal by a chemist named Jean Coutel to form the world's first military balloon corps. And this was known as La Compagnie des Rostiers and consisted of a single hydrogen balloon named L'Entreprenant, or the Enterprise, and 34 officers and men with their own distinct uniforms. And they were first deployed to Maubeuge, where the French were fighting the Dutch. But unfortunately, the French army was rather conservative, and the local commander at Maubeuge really didn't see any use for these newfangled devices and sent Coutel and his troops packing. Thankfully, Coutel was able to petition the government again, conduct a number of demonstrations, and was sent back to the front in time for the Battle of Maubeuge on June 2nd, 1794. And this was the first time balloons were ever used in combat. Now, how this balloon company worked is that 2 men would be sent up in the basket at a time, one to make observations through a spyglass and the other to take notes, while the rest of the company was on the ground operating the winch to raise and lower the balloon. And the notes that the observers took would be packed into sandbags with a little metal clip and sent down the guy wires to the ground where they could be dispatched to the appropriate commanders. Now, an interesting part of this operation was that the hydrogen generators used to fill the balloons were static. The standard method for producing hydrogen at the time was to pass steam over hot iron filings, and this required a big brick-lined furnace and boiler, and it really couldn't be moved around. So the balloons had to be filled in one place and then carried from place to place along the battlefield, floating just a couple of meters above the road. And the handlers had to be very careful to not let the balloon run into trees and get ripped open by branches and things like that. So following its debut at the Battle of Maubeuge, l'Entrepreneur would next be used at the Siege of Charleroi. And General Antoine Morlot, along with Coutel, was able to ascend and from that vantage point see that the Dutch garrison in the town was severely weakened. And indeed, shortly thereafter, the French pressed home an attack and the garrison quickly capitulated. But the finest hour for Coutel would be during the Battle of Fleurus on June 26, 1794. And here, General Morlot and Coutel were able to ascend and stay aloft for 10 hours, directing the battle in real time. And this led to a stunning French victory and a clear demonstration of the utility of the balloon in combat. But despite these successes, not everybody was convinced. When Napoleon Bonaparte came to power, he really had no use for these balloons, and although he took one with him on his expedition to Egypt, he never ended up using it, and the ship carrying it was sunk during the Battle of the Nile. And in 1799, Napoleon ordered the balloon factory shut down and never used any balloons in any of his campaigns. And the French really wouldn't use balloons again in combat for another 70 years. And really, nobody else would either. There were a couple of scattered attempts to use balloons in combat. For example, during the Italian War of Independence in 1849, the Austrians attempted to attack Venice using time bombs attached to balloons. Unfortunately, the wind scattered these, a lot of them back towards the Austrian lines, and they proved ineffective. So the next major use of balloons in combat would be during the American Civil War. And prior to the war, the United States had actually been gripped by a sort of balloon mania where famous aeronauts like John Wise, John LaMountain, and Thaddeus Lowe wowed the American public with their high-flying exploits. And so when war was declared, these aeronauts were very quick to offer their services to the Union Army. But only one of them, Thaddeus Lowe, had the political connections to get an audience with President Abraham Lincoln. And Lincoln was sufficiently impressed by his proposal to authorize government funds to build a number of balloons and conduct a number of demonstrations. And on June 18, 1861, Lowe made history by ascending in a tethered balloon from a spot between the U.S. Capitol building and the Washington Monument and sending the first telegraph message from a balloon. At the same time, a fellow aeronaut, John LaMountain, rose up above Fortress Monroe and was able to spot a hidden Confederate camp and thus save the Union Army in the area from a surprise attack. He also made an ascent from a transport ship named the Fanny, becoming the very first person to do so, and effectively making the Fanny the world's first aircraft carrier. But there were a couple of obstacles standing in the way of the creation of an official Union balloon corps. First was the inherent conservatism of Union generals, including Winfield Scott, who really saw no use for these newfangled devices. The second was the massive egos of the aeronauts themselves. All of them wanted to be the head of the new balloon corps. There was really not room for all of them at the top. And it wasn't until the intervention of General George McClellan that Thaddeus Lowe was finally put in charge of the official U.S. balloon corps, which was formed in November 1861. And Lowe proceeded to produce 7 balloons with patriotic names like the George Washington, the United States, the Intrepid, and in a nod to his French forebears, the Enterprise. And he also invented a new type of hydrogen generator. Now, early on, the balloons were filled from municipal supplies of town gas, which is mainly hydrogen and carbon monoxide. But just as it had been with the Compagnie des Restiers, this was not a very flexible solution. So Thaddeus Lowe invented a hydrogen generator that generated hydrogen by passing sulfuric acid over iron filings. And this was very portable and very convenient. The only problem with it was that the hydrogen it generated contained traces of sulfuric acid that tended to eat the balloons from the inside out. So they did have a limited service life. So Lowe's balloons would first be used at the Battle of Bull Run, or Battle of First Manassas. But his greatest triumph would be at the Battle of Fair Oaks from May 31st to June 1st, 1862. And on the first day of the battle, Lowe was able to ascend and spot an advancing Confederate army, which had initially been dismissed as merely a feint. But he was able to see from its size that this was actually the main thrust, and he was able to save the Union Army from defeat. Now, on the second day of the battle, he ascended, but found that the balloon that he was using was too small to get him to the altitude he wanted. So he descended and attempted to fill a larger balloon, but his hydrogen generator was too slow and the Confederate army was approaching fast. And so he went into yet a smaller balloon and found that this too didn't have as much gas as he needed to reach the altitude he wanted. But what he figured was that he could transfer the gas from the smaller balloon into the larger balloon and get all the gas that he needed to make his ascent. But he really didn't have the equipment to do this. That was when he came up with an inspired MacGyver-like solution where he spotted a cooking pot, asked a fellow Union soldier to cut the bottom off of it, and used it as a transfer pipe to get gas from one balloon into the other. So the Confederacy really didn't have anything with which to answer this technology. They didn't have the industrial capacity or the raw materials to build that many balloons. They did build a few, but because they didn't have access to large quantities of silk of the same color, they ended up making these very bizarre-looking patchwork balloons made up of different colored silk. And this led to a rather romantic legend that these balloons were made of the donated silk dresses of particularly patriotic daughters of the Confederacy. But as I said, they didn't make all that many, they didn't use them very much in combat, and during the Civil War, balloons remained almost an exclusively Union weapon. Yet, despite their success, in the end, the inherent conservatism of the Union Army won out, and by June 1863, the Balloon Corps was disbanded, and balloons would not be used again for the rest of the conflict. But only 5 years later, balloons would once again be used to great effect in their country of origin. So during the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 1871, Paris was entirely surrounded and besieged by the Prussians and cut off from the rest of the world. And the Parisian citizens ended up using balloons in order to maintain communication with the rest of France. So they established balloon factories in a pair of disused railway stations, and between September and November 1870, daring aeronauts made a total of 66 flights carrying 102 passengers and 2.5 million pieces of mail out of the city. And one of the most famous of these flights took place on October 7, 1870, when the Minister of the Interior, Léon Gambetta, flew out of the city and made his way to the provisional capital of Lyon in order to reinvigorate the French war effort. In the end, however, none of this would help the French war effort, and of course the French lost the war. But the experience of Paris clearly demonstrated the utility of balloons in warfare, once again, in this case as a means of communication and transport as opposed to observation. And the rest of the world really took note, and shortly thereafter, many countries started adopting their own balloon companies. So, for example, the Americans would use them in Cuba during the Spanish-American War, the Japanese would use them during the Russo-Japanese War in 1905, and the British would use them in a number of colonial engagements, including the Second Boer War. And the British also introduced a new innovation, which was the use of compressed hydrogen cylinders for filling balloons in the field, which were a lot less cumbersome to use than the original gas generators. But up until this point, balloons had mainly retained their traditional spherical shape, and it was becoming clear that this was not optimal for observation purposes. In a strong wind, these balloons would twist, they would buffet wildly, they would sometimes even turn horizontal at great risk to the observer. And so in 1893, a German inventor named August von Parsifal invented a new type of observation balloon. And instead of spherical, this had a long sausage shape and a windsock-like fin on the rear that would be filled by the wind and help keep the balloon pointed into the wind and keep it stable. And He referred to this as the Draken, or dragon, but because of its resemblance to a piece of the male anatomy, it soon became nicknamed the Freude der Mädchen, or Maiden's Delight. So who says the Germans don't have a sense of humor? And this was a major advance in observation balloon technology and was widely copied. And the French even produced their own improved version called the Caco balloon, which was far more teardrop shaped and had 4 fins in the rear as opposed to a single one underneath in a Parsifal type balloon. Now, when the First World War broke out, most of the belligerents were equipped with either Parsifal or Caco style balloons. And in the static trench warfare of the Western Front, these proved absolutely invaluable for reconnaissance and artillery spotting. And aircraft did exist at the outbreak of war, but they were very limited in their endurance and were not very stable. Whereas an observation balloon could stay aloft for an entire day and was a very stable platform for aerial photography. And to give you an idea of how widely they were deployed, at one point the French had no fewer than 76 balloon companies deployed on the Western Front. And these balloons became so associated with artillery fire that the idiom, the balloon's going up, came to mean an attack is imminent. Now, because of their strategic importance, observation balloons were very heavily defended. They were often ringed by batteries of anti-aircraft guns or machine guns, or given their own fighter patrols, or sometimes surrounded by barrage balloons with heavy steel cables that would rip apart any aircraft that came too close. And balloon observers were equipped with the latest in safety technology, which was parachutes. Now, as I mentioned in my previous video on ejection seats, during the First World War, most pilots didn't actually wear parachutes. First, because they thought it was cowardly, but second, because their officers thought that it would encourage them to bail out at the first sign of trouble, rather than taking the effort to bring their very expensive machines back home. But balloon observers almost always wore parachutes, and these typically took the form of an inverted aluminum container on the side of the basket, which the parachute was packed into, and the shrouds would be attached to the observer's harness. And so if his balloon came under attack, all he had to do was jump out, and the parachute would automatically deploy. Now, given all of these defenses, attacking a balloon was a particularly dangerous proposition. And so some of the bravest and craziest fighter pilots of the war were the so-called balloon busters, who almost exclusively went after observation balloons. And in this field, the ace of aces was Belgian pilot Willy Coppens, with an astounding 35 balloon victories to his credit. And just to give you an idea of how crazy some of these guys were, one of Coppens' favorite tactics was, after shooting the balloon full of holes or shooting out its guy wires, he would land his aircraft on top of the balloon envelope and use it as a shield from ground fire. And once the balloon had dropped to a certain altitude and he was satisfied that it had been destroyed, he would turn on his engine, slide off the side of the balloon, take off, and fly away. But even with balls of solid steel like that, it was a very difficult task to take out a balloon, not only because of the defenses surrounding it, but because up until about halfway through the war, nobody had an effective weapon for taking out a balloon. Hydrogen is flammable, sure, but you can't really ignite it with a simple lead bullet. About the best you can do is, like Coppens, either fill the balloon with so many holes that it starts to leak and fall to the ground, or cut out its guy wires or do some sort of damage like that, but you really can't destroy the balloon that way. And it really wouldn't be until 1916 that a French officer named Lieutenant Yves Prieur came up with the Le Prieur rocket. And this was essentially an overgrown bottle rocket. It was a little gunpowder rocket motor with a long stick out the rear, and this would be mounted to the interplane struts of a fighter aircraft and launched at a balloon or a zeppelin. And the idea was that the burning rocket fuel would ignite the hydrogen as the rocket passed through the envelope. Unfortunately, these were not very accurate. They had very high dispersion, which meant that you had to fire them at extremely close ranges, which was a frightening prospect, because if you managed to ignite the hydrogen, you would be right beside the exploding balloon. And so a better solution was found to be exploding or incendiary bullets. And the British developed 3 different types of these during the war. There was the Pomeroy bullet, the Brock bullet, and the Buckingham bullet. Now, the Pomeroy bullet was an exploding bullet, and it was filled with dynamite. And the idea was that when you fired it, the acceleration would cause the dynamite to separate into nitroglycerin and the Kieselguhr diatomaceous earth that kept it stable. And so you would just have a bullet full of nitroglycerin that hopefully would explode on impact with the target. The Brock bullet was full of potassium chlorate, which is another shock-sensitive explosive, while the Buckingham bullet was an incendiary bullet filled with white phosphorus, and it had little plugs in the back filled with solder, and when the bullet left the barrel, the solder would melt, and the white phosphorus would trickle out the rear and burn on contact with air. And so this is like a tracer round, but with a lot more incendiary material in it, and it was hoped that as this passed through the balloon's envelope, it would ignite the hydrogen. Now, in testing, it was revealed that the ideal solution was actually to use all three of these bullets in a single machine gun belt. And the reason for this is because while hydrogen is flammable, it still needs oxygen to burn. And inside the gas cell of a Zeppelin or the envelope of an observation balloon, it's pure hydrogen. And even with an incendiary round, you're really not going to ignite that unless you can get oxygen into the mix. So the explosive bullets in the belt would blow big holes in the envelope or the gas bags and cause oxygen to mix in, and hopefully this mixture would then be ignited by the incendiary bullets. And this weapon allowed the British to beat off some of the last Zeppelin attacks on the British Isles and allowed them to score a huge number of victories against observation balloons on the European front. Now, the First World War proved to be the high watermark for the use of observation balloons, because by the end of the war, aircraft had become sophisticated enough to take over the reconnaissance and artillery spotting role moving forward. Still, there were certain uses for balloons in combat. So the Second World War saw the extensive use of so-called barrage balloons, which were used to defend factories and cities and other targets from air attack. And the idea was that the cables holding these balloons down would rip apart and destroy any enemy aircraft that got too close. And these were widely used, for example, during the London Blitz in 1940, and later to defend the Normandy beachhead following the landings on June 6, 1944. The Japanese also tried to use balloons as offensive weapons, launching thousands of paper and silk balloons with incendiary bombs across the Pacific, in the hopes of starting forest fires on the US West Coast. Most of these never reached their target, only a handful actually made it to the States, and they didn't cause any casualties except for one family who came across a downed balloon, poked at the incendiary package, and it exploded, killing them all. Slightly more successful was a British operation called Operation Outward, where they launched a number of barrage balloons trailing metal cables across the North Sea into Germany. And the idea here was that the trailing cable would short out power lines and cause power outages. And this was somewhat successful and caused the destruction of at least one power station when it was shorted out, caught fire, and burned to the ground. And balloons even continued to be used after the Second World War well into the Cold War era. There were a number of American projects, including Project Skyhook, Project Genetrix, and Project Mogul, used to spy on the Soviet Union and Communist China. Now, the Genetrix balloons contained a gondola with cameras that would take photos as they drifted over the USSR and China. These were not very successful because you couldn't direct where they went, so they were eventually replaced by the Lockheed U-2 and later the A-12 and SR-71, whereas Project Mogul contained sensitive microphones that were meant to pick up the sound of Soviet nuclear weapons tests. And the crash of one of these Project Mogul balloons in Roswell, New Mexico in 1947 kicked off the whole UFO and crashed alien saucer craze. So today we really don't tend to think of balloons as a viable weapon of war, but as you can see, they actually have a long and proud military heritage going back nearly 200 years. Now, that's all I have for you today. Thank you so much for watching, and a big shout out to Gord Crossley and the rest of the Heritage staff here at 17 Wing for allowing me to film fascinating artifacts just like this one. I can guarantee you there's far more where this came from for future videos. But until then, I'm Jean Messier from Our Own Devices. Have a great day.